I really like the idea of getting a little bit of exploration into the game, so looking around and seeing what was going on. Obviously, it's kind of hard to do in a puzzle platformer without the player kind of feeling like they've missed the point or got lost. And the idea of hunting for things became cool. And I had these switches, so I thought, okay, I'll make a level where you move around, hunting down the switches and jumping on them in order to progress. And I made this level, but the problem is with the playtesters, they got lost. They got confused as to where they were meant to be going, what they were meant to be doing, and it frustrated people. And it didn't feel like a puzzle or a game level because it was so unguided and it just felt boring. The kind of the spotlight was a weird side effect. I'd made spotlights for another part of the game and then decided they weren't quite working and removed them. And this was a perfect opportunity to find a new use for a spotlight. So it's kind of moving around. At the start of the level, it feels like an aesthetic thing, and you look around. And then once you realise it's tied into where the switches are, it becomes a waypoint system kind of for that one level, just at something to point you towards where you should be going. And you're still exploring a bit because you're working out your path to where you're trying to go to. There's a point where a switch appears on the bottom of the platform when you expect it to be on the top, things like that. But it kind of just guides the experience in a nice way. This puzzle here is about teaching the player to do something that's a bit counterintuitive. If you're not someone who's played many puzzle platformers, and to be fair, with some puzzle platformers this doesn't work. But something I really wanted Sarah to be able to do was this kind of slingshot move. So you would jump her in one direction and then use the double jump to push her back in the direction you came from. The idea being that you could kind of avoid an obstacle in midair, so you could jump around something. This is hopefully a really kind of straightforward blank canvas for you to try that move out of. It's kind of like the level where Chris is introduced for the first time. It's kind of quite a little amount of lighting, not a lot going on the screen. Hopefully it just gives you enough room to kind of come to that conclusion on your own. And it's quite fun when you see someone who's not maybe a big puzzle platformer game fan who sits down in front of this. The moment they work out the slingshot, they feel really good. They feel like they've worked out something, and it feels a little bit exploity as well, which I think people get a kick out of. So yeah, that's what this is. This is a setup for doing that later, basically. Sarah was probably the kind of the hardest character to write for, because she's kind of got this whole epic thing going on. She kind of feels... She should hopefully feel a bit Tolkien-esque, a bit kind of, a bit like she's walked in from Game of Thrones. I kind of wanted her to feel aloof and different to the other characters in the scene, kind of sort of like Thor, I guess, in the Marvel comics, that she just sounds a bit off and a bit uncomfortable around everyone else as a result, but doesn't realise how weird she sounds. Getting that right was really hard. Making it so that didn't seem weird, or getting unintentional laughs from it was odd. I think most of the time we stay on just the right side, but it was a challenge, and it kind of distances her, which I quite like. I quite like that she feels kind of separate from the group, and I think a lot of that's achieved by the writing and by the way Danny performed the part. So with this level, it's really about kind of targeting a space vertically. This is something that I've not required you to do before, and you can't really do without Sarah. There's a gap that you have to get through, which if you get it slightly wrong in either direction, you'll die. And it forces you to really think spatially about where that jump's placed, where you use that second jump in order to keep yourself out of harm's way. It's teaching the player to finesse. Hopefully, it's teaching them to play Sarah in a way that they actually think about where they're going, and they use that space and use the character's ability to get the perfect jump, to specifically achieve an objective. I don't force it on the player often, and when I do, I try and do it in a very simple space like this. But it's quite fun. It feels good to the player because you do it well and you feel good. this is a weird one. This level is an excellent example of something very odd that happens. I've talked to other indies, and it happens to most indies. When you're working in a studio, you're sat in a professional environment, an office, surrounded by pros, and you get the job done, and maybe you listen to music, but you just kind of get on with it. With Thomas, I built it at home, and I was sat next to my television at home on my computer, and I like background noise, so I put films on. And weirdly, this specific level I made while watching some obscure old Robert Downey Jr. movie. So for me, this level this is no insight on the game design, and I apologise for wasting your time, but this level always makes me think of Robert Downey Jr. And it's weird how those kind of, it's a weird phenomenon that indies, often like bits of games that we worked on, will be coloured by whatever movie we had on or whatever TV show we had playing while we were working on that level. So this level for me is Robert Downey Jr.'s level. No insight at all on the game design there. Wasting your time. So this is kind of the place where that balancing two characters on top of each other mechanic kind of gets made more complex. So you have a third character in it that you have to kind of factor in your choices, and you have to kind of carry one character across, switch, and take the other one back. You also can die to get the achievement there in the bottom corner, but it's really about just extrapolating on that concept that you learnt and mastered earlier, and just taking it off in a different direction, and this time with Sarah to make that a bit more interesting. So this is the Fountain of Knowledge or Wisdom, depending on on which bit of dialogue I'm using at that specific point. And this was a cool thing. I'm quite proud of this one. This had to be a big moment, because this is the moment where Thomas kind of becomes self-aware. This is the moment where they realise the context they're in, they realise about the outside world, and it kind of establishes that. It's also a chance to do a really big, cool particle effect, which I'm quite proud of. Interesting little bit of trivia: the images that are flowing past there are the Twitter avatars of all of my Twitter followers who replied "yes please" to a tweet from me saying, "Would you like to be in a particle effect in Thomas Was Alone?" So those are the true believers. I had way less Twitter followers back then, and yeah, it's a cool moment. It's also a really interesting moment for Sarah, because this is obviously Sarah's like objective and dream was to get into this fountain, and she is cruelly kind of separated out from it, and the layout of the level kind of forces her to watch the exact moment where Thomas achieves her dream and she doesn't. And the story does some fun stuff around that, but it's a nice kind of mix here of one character feeling awesome and the other character being, feeling less awesome. And I think it works. 69 actually was an attempt to go back to that earlier level, the level I think I described as jazzy, where the environment's changing, but this time let the player change their environment. So the player's kind of forming the level for themselves here. So you move the platforms into position by pressing switches, which allows another character to get to a new switch, which they can then use to get to a new switch, and there's a nice kind of progression and back and forth through the level. This was also, from a game designer point of view, this was a really fun level to put together, because I had to work out kind of the geometry that would allow for this, so that you had this world changing but nothing broke and it looked cool in all of its formations. And it was a really fun level to make. I hope it's as fun to play as it was to make, because it was an interesting challenge to make all those pieces look good and move around in a fun way. So building on the idea of the player kind of editing their environment, this was another idea. This was one of those experiential things where it didn't really come from a puzzle per se. It came from an idea that I thought would be quite fun visually and from a player perspective. So this is a box which gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you interact with it, and kind of compresses the player characters down in space. It felt really nice mechanically. I got into a stage with some of these levels around this area where it became about making the level really interesting in the way that it moved or changed, and trying to achieve kind of an aesthetic, emotive sense to these levels. Because by this point the player knows the mechanics, so I'm freer to do that. I don't do it much, and you've got to pace that with content which is perhaps a bit more fun, or a bit more immediately puzzling or interesting in that sense. But I think just taking a moment to have a few levels that are just cool in the way they work is something that I know I appreciate in games. I love it in the game in Edge, where I think it's called Metro, where there's a level. This is a game made up entirely of cubes, where it feels like an underground train station, and they achieve that purely by moving some cubes around in a way that feels interesting. And I kind of wanted to play around with some ideas like that. So these levels coming up, the objective here was to complete all of the character arcs, because as you know, spoilers, this is the point where we actually leave these characters behind, and all of them have a journey they have to go on. So I'll talk a little bit more as we go through, but essentially the first character to deal with is Thomas. Thomas's journey, and no one gets this except for there's 3 or 4 people, and that's my failing. That's absolutely my failing. But what I was going for, what I was hoping people would kind of take away from Thomas is a creative. He's someone who wants to make. He doesn't start off wanting to make stuff that's cool. He's very interested in the world. He sees things. He's observant. He's having fun just looking at the world. And then he kind of discovers that he doesn't like certain things about this world. And that's the point during these levels where he decides to change things. He decides to create something, and he creates these new characters who go on to achieve what he wanted to achieve originally. And it's nice. It feels like a nice kind of illustration of that creative process. Of kind of creative people tend to, at least the ones I've met, tend to be really, really interested in everything, and I kind of like it's not part of the process that I've really seen depicted, and I kind of like the idea of Thomas being that guy who has to know why that thing works the way it does, and is intrigued by the world around him. And I don't think the players necessarily realise that straight away, but I hope that during these kind of levels you realise that that's the journey Thomas has come on, towards kind of becoming a creative or a creator. So this is a chance to do something that I'm surprised I don't do much of in the game up to this point, and I think I would probably go back and do a little bit more of it. Is moving targets. Is having targets where time is a factor in the placement as well. So here it's really simple. I basically have two position sets. And you just have to move your characters into one of those sets, which is fine. What's interesting is because the sets keep moving, most players, as they're putting this together, lose track of which set they're trying to build, and that's where the puzzle comes in, is just paying attention to which layout you're attempting. Both are possible, obviously, but doing half of one and half of the other is not it's not going to win you the level. So it's a fun one from that point of view, that it kind of plays with players' perceptions a little bit. It's also quite a nice one screen level. There's not many of these in the game, but I do like pulling them out every now and again. It's a nice way of mixing things up a bit, and aesthetically I just really like one level, one screen, and that's how the Flash game worked, of course. So the other story that they needed to be kind of continued and completed was this story of how John reacts to Sarah. Is that Sarah basically is John, but more so. And I really like the idea of him being massively intimidated at first by that and jealous, but actually that freeing him a little bit, because he doesn't need to be insecure, because there is someone who's demonstrably better at jumping than he is. And he kind of comes to terms with that and likes the idea of making other people feel awesome about themselves. He becomes much more selfless. He starts off very selfishly at the start of the game, and through his interactions with Sarah becomes the selfless character, which is really cool. And obviously, at the very end of these levels where he's useless to this new. There are no yellow trigger zones later on. He is not going to be a part of this success, and he's kind of okay with that because he feels he's facilitated it and he's helped out with it. So that's a nice journey, and I like the way John progresses, and I like the way that his story ends. I mentioned earlier the how late the checkpoints came in, and that was a very late addition to the game, and I think I pointed out that was pretty stupid. This is the mechanic I added 2 weeks before launch. I was playing for the first time. I tried FIFA. I was playing a football video game, not playing football, and I hated it, but I liked the idea of a ball, and it kind of rooted in my mind. I wanted to add a ball to Thomas, and I didn't want to, it wasn't going to go in too many levels, but I liked the idea of having 1 or 2 places where it fit. And I knew that during these kind of levels, you have been with the same characters for a little while, so introducing a new mechanic kind of felt logical and felt like it would be good for the player's kind of sanity. So the ball obviously became a diamond because curves do not exist in this universe, and it became quite a cool little physics object you bounce around. It caused quite a few headaches in terms of the way character interactions work, because physics in Thomas is not realistic. It's it's not realistic obviously because it's a video game jump, but actually more so than that in terms of when you carry characters, the fact that they don't slide off you, for example. So there's quite a bit of tweaks and fiddling going on behind the scenes to make the game feel the way I wanted it to feel, and the ball kind of contradicts a lot of that. So it became quite a bit more challenging than I thought it was going to be. But it actually adds, I think, a lot to these last few levels with these characters, that you play with it in an interesting way. The fact that it's got the diagonals on it means that the way you interact with it is kind of akin to a football, that you're kind of bouncing it around the level and kind of specifically kind of hitting it from different sides in order to change its direction, things like that. And the big challenge actually was working out how to make it interact with the existing systems in the game. Making it a specific Switch variant was the perfect solution. That it felt logical, the player understood it, and it used it used a way of communicating that had been set up before in a nice way, and it fits into the existing systems. So this is similar to some of the stuff I do earlier in the game with multiple areas with different characters interacting indirectly. But what's nice about the ball was that it allowed me to make levels like this one, where you have different characters in different areas interacting with one object that gets moved around and passed around in different ways. And that was cool because it meant I could kind of separate the characters but have an object that moves between them. Because you don't directly control the ball, it becomes a kind of a passive object in the world that you have to interact with in interesting ways. It's basically kind of like, I guess, the companion cube from Portal, that it becomes something that takes on a meaning because it's something that's passed between different characters in this scene. So yeah, I really like this level. I never did get on the bottom right of the water, the particle effect kind of bleeds out of the wall, and I hate that. I never got that right, and I never worked out how to fix that problem. So yeah, half-finished game. So this was a point where I realised that there was an interesting possibility for an interaction between Sarah and Laura. I'd not played with those two before. Because Sarah has that mid-air jump, if she bounces once and then jumps in mid-air, you actually get some quite interesting movement out of her. So the idea of an environment where you could play with that, where you kind of combined the bounce with the secondary jump, felt cool, and that's what this level became. And it weirdly becomes Pong or Breakout or any of those kind of games, and in a way that I really like. It's kind of nostalgic, and it kind of works. It's fun. It's a little bit repetitive potentially, but I do like it, and I really like the nod to Pong.
Laura had been born special. She understood that now. She was created to help others. If her bounce could be passed on, then this would all have been worthwhile.
So this is another area where the characters are kind of divided. I had quite a bit of... it was quite an important piece of story here. This is the moment where Thomas does decide to basically change the world. So I deliberately kept this one pretty simple. This isn't a very challenging environment. It's more of just somewhere for you to interact with and exist for a little while until we get so basically so you can hit the story beat. There's a couple of places in the game where I deliberately kind of slow the pace while something important's being said in the story. This is just a good example of one such place where it was important to kind of step back and let that dialogue from Danny, which I'm talking over right now, play out, so you can just see what's going on. I loved as a kid the game Mousetrap, and this is kind of my ode to Mousetrap. It's similar to a couple of the other levels that you've got kind of a sequence of different characters interacting with the same ball, but here it's much more specifically a journey that ball's going on from one end of the level to another, and that feels... I really like this level. It's, like I said, it's a nod to Mousetrap. It's kind of, it takes you in some interesting directions. There's also some quite cute ideas in there around the kind of, when that little lever that kind of flips the ball upwards that you catch in midair with James. Stuff like that just kind of grew out organically as the level was being designed. And it just feels nice. It feels sufficiently different in terms of the way you interact with it than any previous level. And it goes back to that kind of thing I was talking about earlier of the experiential element. That this level's so much more about how it feels than how challenging it is to work out.
John's massive jumps were dwarfed by Sarah. For the first time in his life, he felt humbled, not as good as someone else. He realized that he wanted to make every AI up there feel as heroic as he had. He liked the sound of that.
Okay, so this is, again, kind of still riffing off the idea of characters in separate rooms. But what's cool here is the approach has been to make those several rooms join together. So you're kind of opening up the space, and the characters kind of overlap in interesting ways. This one was really about the way the paths work for the characters. So you feel like you've really travelled this space. You take characters from one end to another, you take some characters just slightly over to the side. You've got Laura and Sarah there just kind of on their own, bouncing away as a nice little metronome for the level. You've got kind of an interesting journey for each of the characters in this level, and they're all overlapping, so it's a level that feels really good because they're separate, but they're also kind of overlapping constantly, and some of the puzzles require more than one of them at once. Okay, so this is the last environment for these characters, which was a controversial choice on my part, to say the least. This is the point where they essentially overcome what they are. They become heroes. Claire passes on her skill, Sarah passes on hers, Laura passes on hers. Oh my god, I've just realised that most of the characters that give up their powers selflessly are female. I don't know what I was trying to say there, except James. James is male, so that ruins any reading like that. And it's a nice moment where basically I hope that most players assume that this is a game about characters escaping. I hope that most players assume when they start the game that the last level will be Thomas escaping. And I like to subvert that. I like the fact that these characters don't get out, that they become part of the system, that they essentially give themselves so that the others can escape. There's a certain kind of heroism there. There's almost a mythical quality of them kind of sacrificing themselves for their kind. It also had to feel pretty epic, so that kind of final moment, where the characters step into the Matrix, there is a hopefully a cool feeling to that. They're also, the way they're arranged means that the characters whose traits are not carried over are not in the particle effects, not in the Matrix itself. They're kind of out to the side, which probably no one notices, but is a nice little moment for just kind of establishing what might happen next. I didn't want to make it clear how they were going to affect the world, so I couldn't say too much at this point, but I hope that on a second playthrough players kind of spot that all when they listen to this. And this is Gray. This is a new character. I'm not sure what players expect. I hope that the ones that have been paying attention kind of realise that the characters up to this point are now gone. I wonder if some of them think that this is going to be a continuation like before, but hopefully that loss kind of sets in. With Gray, there's a few things about Gray that are important. One is he's grey. And that's actually a functional thing, that all these characters are grey because their colours, once they start to gain their abilities, needed to show up. So grey became a logical thing. So they're all shades of grey. Having the first character introduced coloured grey, I think kind of helps that to take a little bit longer to sink in, so players kind of just accept that the character's called Gray. Gray is an interesting character here because he is essentially the fall from grace. He starts off kind of optimistic, a little bit arrogant. He immediately kind of judges the world for allowing him to be awesome, which is a very odd reaction to success. But he becomes darker and darker as the levels go on, and eventually kind of obviously betrays everyone. So it's cool. This level, the main focus of this level was to frame the moment where the player gains the floating in water ability. They don't know what these shapes are. It's kind of classic Mario thing of you can't fail to get them at water ability, but I wanted to make sure that that moment felt cool. I wanted to kind of echo that moment where Claire becomes aware that she's got superpower. But the idea that Gray starts off without one and then gains one during this sequence is it's basically, if I can get the player to learn during these moments that that's how those things work, then this level's achieved its objective, both from a gameplay perspective and obviously narratively. So Joe and Sam are the couple, kind of long-term couple of the game. They're interesting. They have a good relationship. Joe starts off a little bit, I guess, whiny, but comes around very quickly. And they're cool. The purpose of this level obviously is to kind of build on what we've just seen with Gray and introduce the idea of these two characters shifting their abilities. The fact that you can shift to an ability for one character without shifting the ability of the other, things like that. Just kind of extrapolating on the learning from the previous level, hopefully in an environment that's pretty safe. The only skill that's required in this level is jumping, and obviously by this point you know how to jump. The whole game's kind of trained you in that. So again, hopefully kind of a safe environment in which to learn. Water obviously had to be there, so there had to be some hazard. But again, hopefully that's mitigated. So Joe and Sam are the couple, kind of long-term couple of the game. They're interesting. They have a good relationship. Joe starts off a little bit, I guess, whiny, but comes around very quickly. And they're cool. The purpose of this level obviously is to kind of build on what we've just seen with Gray and introduce the idea of these two characters shifting their abilities. The fact that you can shift to an ability for one character without shifting the ability of the other, things like that. Just kind of extrapolating on the learning from the previous level, hopefully in an environment that's pretty safe. The only skill that's required in this level is jumping, and obviously by this point you know how to jump. The whole game's kind of trained you in that. So again, hopefully kind of a safe environment in which to learn. Water obviously had to be there, so there had to be some hazard. But again, hopefully that's mitigated. So Joe and Sam are the couple, kind of long-term couple of the game. They're interesting. They have a good relationship. Joe starts off a little bit, I guess, whiny, but comes around very quickly. And they're cool. The purpose of this level, obviously, is to kind of build on what we've just seen with Gray and introduce the idea of these two characters shifting their abilities. The fact that you can shift to an ability for one character without shifting the ability of the other, things like that, just kind of extrapolating on the learning from the previous level, hopefully in an environment that's pretty safe. The only skill that's required in this level is jumping, and obviously by this point you know how to jump. The whole game's kind of trained you in that. So again, hopefully kind of a safe environment in which to learn. Water obviously had to be there, so there had to be some hazard. But again, hopefully that's mitigated. This is an interesting environment. The plan here was to just basically play very briefly with what Gray can do. So here he's floating upwards. This is slightly different to anti-gravity because obviously anti-gravity you can jump. Whereas in this level, because it's water, you can't jump down from the ceiling. So it became a case of there's a challenge to that the player gets stuck or can find their way onto. They can't opt out of falling on spikes. So it kind of works in an interesting way. It's not actually water. It's kind of faking it. He's basically, for this level, Gray is treated like an anti-gravity character. It's a total cheat, but it kind of hopefully introduces the idea that a character can, for an entire level, be of a certain ability. It's also, to be honest, a cool moment. It's kind of an inverted version of Chris's fall from earlier, so I like it for that reason. So things are pacing up at this point. By this point, I'm less inclined to give people safe space to learn a new mechanic, because at this point you've been playing the game for a while, you get it. I like to think that the challenges of the game are such that you accept that you're now going to be in danger from this point on. So here is obviously the big introduction of the fact that there can be more than one ability in a space. It's important to establish this kind of quite early on, because I didn't want players to get confused by what happened if they had one ability and then they flipped to another ability. Do those abilities get combined? Do they then have both of those abilities? And it had to be a toggle for lots of reasons. It would have been very, very difficult to make levels fun. It would also have been very hard to allow players to disable an ability, which is obviously a big part of some of the puzzles later on. So yeah, with this one, it was really about teaching the player how to logically progress through a space where they had the opportunity to change their abilities, and also how they could combine two characters with different abilities to win. So you have to carry one character on another character here, you have to bounce one character on another character there. It's just a way of establishing that the relationship of characters becomes actually kind of even weirder than it has previously, because whereas before, obviously Laura's ability is static, she's always going to bounce things, whereas here you can kind of tweak what a character is. You can mod characters to be whatever you need them to be, and then that gets piled on with their kind of inherent traits in terms of their size and their jump height to make their own new characters. So there's lots of permutations that happen, and giving that in an environment that's kind of straightforward and kind of a logical linear progression. There's a reason the level's kind of really straightforward in terms of you go from right to left. It's just really simple, just to kind of let players work that out for themselves, but this time in a bit more of a dangerous environment. So here I'm establishing Paul as his own character. There's a lot of reasons to do it on his own, just kind of narratively I just wanted to establish him before he's put into a scenario with Gray. The The new mechanic here, gameplay-wise, is the fact that your relationship to the environment shifts. So as you progress through this level, sometimes you can float, sometimes you can't, and those shifts are forced on you. You don't have a choice. And what that does is that just kind of reiterates the fact that that shifting can be both a negative thing and a positive thing. And that's kind of important for later, because there will be points later where you have to avoid trigger zones in order to progress and to survive. So here's another example of a level that's kind of intentionally pretty simple, just to kind of allow the player to get used to a narrative point. So this is the point where Gray and Paul meet. The player needs to understand that Gray's starting to be a bit dodgy, and that he's going to betray Paul. That he's going to take all this information that Paul tells him and use it in a bad way. So it's kind of a simple level, but also there is some interesting spatial stuff going on that you have to kind of adjust the positions of Paul and Gray on those steps in order to get the bounce right. There's a few different ways of doing it, but it's kind of interesting. This is one that there's a lot of little different changes in the way you play this level, and I like that about it. I like that players can find their own solution. So this, and I do this a lot with these two characters, this is a kind of a journey level, so this is really just kind of progressing in a straightforward way from left to right. But hopefully what I'm going for is that this is actually a really interesting back and forth between the characters. So you're using them and switching their abilities up in order to get them to kind of leapfrog the other character into the position you need them in. So again, this is one that's not so much the puzzle as the feeling of it. And hopefully it's a fun journey. I want the player to really warm to these characters for reasons that should hopefully become very obvious.
Maybe Sam had done the right thing after all. It was getting a bit chilly though.
This is an opportunity to add a new trigger zone. So here we have obviously the double jump, which came from Sarah. This is to be honest, again, a quite straightforward environment, but just enough room that the player can work out what it is. There's a lot of communication going on in terms of hopefully explaining to you what each kind of thing does, what each different ability shift does. Obviously the colours are the same colours as the characters they're from. That's something that a lot of people don't actually pick up on. But it's still required to give these environments that kind of... So this level was kind of... And this is an opportunity to add a new trigger zone. So here we have obviously the double jump, which came from Sarah. This is to be honest, again, a quite straightforward environment, but just enough room that the player can work out what it is. There's a lot of communication going on in terms of hopefully explaining to you what each kind of thing does, what each different ability shift does. Obviously the colours are the same colours as the characters they're from. That's something that a lot of people don't actually pick up on. But it's still required to give these environments that kind of act as a sandbox for the player to work out what an ability shift does. Also, it's nice because it lets me do little character moments at the same time as introducing these new mechanics. So this level was kind of came from a lot of different things. There's a couple of different mechanics, or not mechanics, but kind of interactions I wanted to play with here. One was the idea of a challenging trigger zone to get to that then makes the journey away from it easy. So right at the start, that water trigger zone, it's kind of hard to get to. You have to jump across lots of stepping stones, with the hazard and danger obviously being water, but then you get the water ability and then you just cruise through the water, and it's a nice moment where you feel empowered. So that's the first thing. The second thing I really wanted to play with was the idea of jumping into a trigger zone in midair and then using that ability, falling into a trigger zone and then using that ability while you were in the trigger zone, which I also do later on. So those two kind of little moments of interaction that I kind of wanted the player to experience. The first one is purely an experiential thing. The second thing is more of kind of a puzzle to just work out. That's how you're meant to interact with it. And both of them are obviously used quite a bit later on.